My name is Margaret Hill. I am 60 years old, and for 25 years I served as a Relief Society leader in the church. I believed every word, every teaching, every promise. I gave my time, my faith, and my silence because, deep down, I thought I was serving God. But there are things I saw, things that no one should see inside a place that calls itself sacred. For a long time, I told myself that keeping quiet was an act of faith. Today I understand that it was fear. After decades of loyalty, I finally understood the price of my silence. I used to think that being loyal to the church was the same as being loyal to God, until I learned the difference. Please comment on which city and country you are watching from. Leave a like if you believe that faith should never hide the truth, and sign up for more true stories that reveal what many are afraid to talk about. I remember perfectly the day I was called to serve as a Relief Society leader. It was an ordinary Sunday morning, but to me, it felt like a calling straight from heaven. The bishop called me into his office, smiled, and said in a soft voice, "Sister Margaret, the Lord needs you. He wants you to lead the women of this ward." At that moment, I felt a warmth rise in my chest, a mixture of humility and pride. I, an ordinary woman, chosen to care for God's daughters. I left that room with tears in my eyes and a heart beating, stronger than ever. Back then, I believed that service was the greatest act of faith. I began to study more, to pray more, to dress even more modestly. Every meeting, every visit, every counsel was treated as something sacred. Relief Society was the heart of the ward, a quiet refuge where women supported each other, sewed clothes for the needy, prepared meals for funerals, and organized prayers for the sick. We believed we were weaving the love of Christ with our own hands. Sunday mornings had a special glow. I would arrive early at the chapel, even before the first prayer was said, and open the windows of the women's lounge. The scent of waxed wood mingled with the soft perfume of the sisters who would soon arrive with their children, scriptures in hand and serene faces. There was something almost heavenly in the simplicity of that environment. When I saw all those women gathered, singing in unison, "I am a daughter of a loving God," I felt that heaven was there within the white walls and under the filtered light of the stained glass windows. Every Sunday, I strove to be an example. I prepared my lessons meticulously, read the scriptures late into the night, underlining passages about purity, obedience, and service. The bishop often praised me, saying I was a pillar of the ward, an example of faith and discipline. I sincerely believed these words came from the Spirit. Little did I know that, in time, those same words would become invisible chains that would prevent me from seeing the truth. The position demanded more than I had imagined. Besides the weekly meetings, there were home visits, counseling, and the constant duty of watching over the sisters, especially the younger ones. The church taught us that every woman needed to be strong and worthy, which in practice meant submissive, modest, and silent. I didn't see this as oppression. I saw it as divine order. "A wise woman builds her house," we repeated like a mantra, and I, with pride, tried to be the living example of that phrase. At the monthly Relief Society meetings, the atmosphere was one of reverence and joy. The sisters exchanged recipes, made fasting plans, and laughed through tears as they recounted how the Lord had helped them through difficulties. Many came from humble homes, with absent or unemployed husbands. I saw in them the strength of feminine faith. I found it beautiful how, even with pain and weariness, they all seemed to find solace in the church. In that space, we believed that God saw every sacrifice. I myself felt that this calling was confirmation that I was seen by the Lord. There was no salary, no public recognition outside the chapel, but there was something more powerful, the feeling of being chosen. When I went up to the pulpit to give a message, I saw in the sisters' eyes the same faith that shone in mine. I spoke about patience, about forgiveness, about trusting in priesthood authority. And, as I said those words, I deeply believed them. As the months passed, my life revolved entirely around the church. Friends who weren't members began to drift away. "You spend more time at the chapel than at home," they'd say. I'd smile and reply, "That's God's house." My husband, though not as devout, respected my enthusiasm. He said Relief Society made me calmer, more disciplined, and, in a way, it was true. Serving made me feel important, needed, even enlightened. The leaders of other wards invited me to give talks, and I gladly accepted. I spoke about the purity of the daughters of Zion, about how we should follow the advice of leaders without questioning, for they see further than we do. I said this with conviction, without imagining that one day those same words would become the bitterest echo of my past. There was something almost magical about the way the church involved women's lives. From the first piano chord to the last amen, everything seemed designed to remind us of who we were and what we should be. The older sisters cared for the younger ones like spiritual mothers. The young women, in turn, looked to us as examples of unwavering faith. It was a perfect circle, or so it seemed. I especially remember the weekly meetings with the priesthood leaders. They spoke to us gently, but there was always a tone of authority that could not be questioned. They said that our role was to support the bishop, not to question his decisions. He is the guardian of the spiritual purity of the ward, they would repeat. I listened and agreed, feeling part of something divine. Once, a sister asked me, "Sister Margaret, do you never get tired? Do you never have doubts?" I smiled and replied, "When we serve God, tiredness is just a reminder that He trusts us." Today, when I remember those words, I realize how asleep I was, confusing submission with faith, silence with holiness. But at that time, I saw nothing wrong with it. The church was the center of my life, and I believed that serving was the purest path to heaven. For 25 years, I lived for that calling. I watched girls grow up, get married, become mothers, and sometimes return in tears seeking advice. I listened, prayed, comforted, always within the limits of what was permitted to be said. And even when something troubled me, I remembered the bishop's words, "Sister Margaret, sometimes silence is the best way to serve." Those words became my guiding light. I followed them with devotion, believing I was obeying God. Today, I realized that that sacred calling was not just a mission, it was also the beginning of a long spiritual imprisonment, because, throughout these 25 years, I've learned that there are two ways to serve: with your voice, or with silence. And silence, when imposed by fear, is not faith, it's renunciation. On the day I accepted the calling, I surrendered with a pure heart. But what I didn't know was that, at that very moment, I also began to lose my freedom. Over time, I realized that the call to serve came with something heavier than duty. It came with an ideal, a model of woman that we were all taught to be: pure, obedient, smiling, tireless, the wife who never complains, the mother who never fails, the leader who never doubts. The standard was so high that it bordered on the impossible, but no one dared to say it aloud. Within the church, being a woman meant being an example, and being an example meant hiding any weakness. Sunday meetings always seemed like little displays of virtue. The sisters arrived impeccably dressed, with modest dresses, their hair tied back, and that same controlled smile. A smile that, over time, I learned to decipher. I saw pain behind many of them. I saw looks that pleaded for rest, for comfort, for a chance to be human again. But, from the pulpit, we always said the same words: "The Lord strengthens us. We are blessed. All is well." The truth is, things were almost never okay. I saw marriages silently crumbling, young women crushed by guilt for not being perfect enough, exhausted women trying to support families alone, unable to admit they were tired. Each carried an invisible burden, but no one could show weakness. The fear of being judged, of appearing spiritually weak, was greater than the pain. In every class, in every council, we were reminded that the Lord's gaze and that of the leaders was upon us. The message was clear. It wasn't enough to believe in God. It was necessary to appear faithful at all times. The bishop used to say that the women of the church are the mirror of the purity of the home, and with that, he transformed us into a showcase of holiness. Every gesture, every word, every outfit needed to reflect the image of a daughter worthy of Zion. There was a phrase we repeated like a prayer: "Women of faith are the foundation of the kingdom of God." I believed it, and it was beautiful. Until I realized that being the foundation often meant being the weight that held everything up, never able to collapse. While the men preached, decided, and led the meetings, we took care of what was left. If a leader erred, we were the ones who fixed it. If a marriage crumbled, we were the ones who comforted. And if a sister fell into sin, we were the ones who wept for her, but always silently, without questioning the reason for so many falls within a system that claimed to protect us. I remember one night in particular. We had just finished a long meeting, and one of the sisters, a sweet woman in her 40s, stayed to talk to me. She seemed nervous, her eyes welling up with tears. She said she couldn't stand trying to be perfect anymore. that she prayed every day, but felt that God wasn't listening to her. "I do everything right, Sister Margaret, but it seems like he has forgotten me." I held her hands and repeated what I had been taught. "Keep praying. He has a purpose." She smiled, but that smile was a farewell. The following week, she stopped attending the meetings. No one asked why. The bishop simply said, "She needs time," and time became synonymous with forgetfulness. That was the first time something inside me broke. I understood, even without words, that the faith we taught wasn't a shelter, it was a wall. And behind that wall, many women were crumbling alone. There was a kind of silent competition among us, as if holiness could be measured. Who prayed more? Who cooked for more families? Who had the most exemplary home? Who wept most fervently during the hymns? Everything was about appearances, and I, without realizing it, became part of it. Smiled, preached, repeated the same speeches about patience and submission, while inside I felt increasingly distant from the God I once thought I knew. I began to realize how much fear governed our lives: fear of making mistakes, fear of displeasing leaders, fear of being excluded. It was as if faith were an endless ladder, and the higher we climbed, the further we drifted from ourselves. The younger sisters would come to me, saying they couldn't be like the exemplary women of Relief Society. I would respond with kind words, but inside I knew they were right. No one could be that. It was a role, a character. The pressure to be perfect was so great that even suffering had to be elegant. If we lost a loved one, we were supposed to cry with dignity. If a marriage was falling apart, we were supposed to endure it in prayer. And if something bothered us within the church, we were supposed to keep it in our hearts and let the Lord take care of it. It was a culture of silence disguised as faith. I remember when a sister was advised to pray more because her husband mistreated her. The bishop said she should be an example of patient love. I was at that meeting. I listened, and I remained silent. That day I realized that, within the church, forgiveness was mandatory, but truth was optional. Women who dared to question were labeled difficult, proud, or inspired by the adversary. So, we learned to be silent, to smile, to conform, to obey. Because disobeying was synonymous with rebellion, and rebellion, we were told, was the first step toward damnation. I watched strong sisters slowly being destroyed from the inside. And yet, they remained standing, with the same smile as always. Even me. Especially me. Because, if the Relief Society leader faltered, what would the others say? The responsibility of being an example prevented me from being true to myself. It was like living on a stage. The audience was the entire ward, and God, supposedly, the director. But there was something no one told us. When faith is based solely on appearances, it ceases to be faith and becomes theater. And theater, however beautiful it may seem, saves no one. Over the years, that burden began to make me ill. I slept little, cried in secret, and felt guilty even for feeling tired. I believed that questioning was doubting God. So, I punished myself with fasts, prayers, and promises. It was a desperate attempt to maintain my dignity, even without knowing what dignity meant. Today, looking back, I understand that we weren't just women of faith. We were women who were afraid of losing God's love, when in reality, what we could lose was only the love of the institution that spoke in His name. We were taught to smile while we were breaking down inside. We were taught to smile while we broke inside. It was during my 8th year as a Relief Society leader that I began to hear the first whispers, small confessions, whispered with shame, always between tears and looks, that pleaded for secrecy. At first, they seemed like mere outpourings from weary women, wives burdened with children, debts, and absent husbands. But, little by little, the stories began to change tone. They were less about the harshness of life, and more about the cruelty of silence. I remember a cold night after a meeting. A young, newlywed sister waited until everyone else had left to find me. The door was ajar, and the hallway empty. She entered slowly, her eyes red and her hands trembling. She said her husband had lost his temper again, that he hit her, but immediately regretted it, that the bishop already knew and had advised patience and prayer. He said, "The Lord is testing my faith." "Sister Margaret," she whispered, her voice almost fading. "But what if this test kills me?" I remained silent for a few seconds, unsure what to say. The right words seemed too dangerous. I hugged her and promised to pray for her. Deep down, I knew I needed to do more, but the rules were clear. Everything had to be handled with prudence, and in a spirit of confidentiality, I took the matter to the bishop, hoping he would act with compassion. He listened in silence, his hands clasped on the table, and then calmly replied, Sister Margaret, sometimes women confuse the husband's role with abuse. The Lord has called men to lead. It is up to us to help them understand their place. His words sent chills down my spine. But she's hurt, Bishop, I insisted. He smiled, like someone comforting. A child, love corrects, sister. Let's not interfere in what is a matter of the home. Just pray with her and encourage obedience. I left that room with a lump in my throat. Part of me wanted to believe he was right, that God would resolve things quietly. The other, quieter part screamed. But I silenced it, because I had been taught that to doubt the authority of the priesthood was to doubt the Lord himself. After that night, I realized that the sister's pain had its own language made of glances, hesitations, and long pauses between sentences, and I began to hear it everywhere. An 18-year-old girl came to me crying, saying she no longer wanted to do worthiness interviews with the bishop's counselor. She said he asked questions that made her uncomfortable, about purity, about the body, about impure thoughts. I was paralyzed. She looked me in the eyes and asked, Is this normal, Sister Margaret? I didn't know the answer. I went to the bishop again, and he, in the same calm tone, said, Some young people misinterpret interview methods. This is a faithful man. He would never put a young woman's dignity at risk. The enemy is trying to create confusion. Confusion. That was the word that always came up when someone tried to explain something. The problem was never the behavior, it was the perception. The blame, somehow, always fell back on the speaker. And then came another case. A middle-aged sister confided that one of the district leaders had a special fondness for her, that he made inappropriate compliments, and once, during a visit, held her hand for too long. She was taken aback, unsure if it was a test or a temptation. And what did I say? What did we all say? Pray for him. The Lord will take care of it. I began to notice a pattern. The stories changed, but the response was always the same. Silence, prudence, trust. It was as if the church had created its own language to silence women, soft, spiritual words that sounded like faith, but served only to mask fear. Even so, I continued to believe that silence was the right path. We cannot tarnish the name of the church, the leaders said. The enemies of the gospel love exaggeration. I repeated these phrases to myself like a shield, trying to convince myself that obeying was the same as protecting what was good. Over time, I began to collect stories, not on paper, but within my soul. Faces that returned in dreams, voices that pleaded for help I didn't know how to give. Each one left an invisible scar, but I kept them as if they were sacred secrets, believing I was protecting the church from external attacks. I didn't realize that, in truth, I was protecting sin. I remember a meeting where a senior leader visited our ward. He spoke about the importance of unity and trust in leadership. He said that criticism and murmuring came from the adversary, and that the true disciple was the one who obeyed even when he didn't understand. That deeply affected me. I thought, so that's it. Maybe God is testing me, asking me to remain silent. During that time, silence became my armor. Every time a sister cried in my office, I would repeat, Let's trust in the Lord. And she would look at me with eyes full of despair, waiting for another answer that never came. Sometimes, I myself believed I was helping. Other times, I felt I was lying, but in the name of faith, whispers began to become echoes. And, from hearing them so often, I began to perceive the sound of something breaking not outside, but inside me. Still, I continued. He kept praying, smiling, teaching, advising, telling myself that a secret pain was better than a public scandal. One night, while reviewing my notes for a class, I realized I had unintentionally written, Keeping silent is protecting the Lord. I stared at that sentence for minutes, and a question pierced my heart like a blade. Does God need me to hide men's sins in order to protect him? It was the first time I felt fear, not of the bishop, nor of the church, but of myself. Fear of having confused faith with blind obedience. Fear of realizing that the love I believed to be pure might be sustaining the very system that hurt the women I had sworn to care for. That day, I closed my eyes and prayed silently. But, for the first time, the words wouldn't come. All I could think was, Lord, if your gospel needs my silence to survive, then perhaps it is not yours. And even without the courage to admit it out loud, I knew. Faith that protects sin. ceases to be faith. But I still wasn't ready to accept that. So I did what I was always taught to do. I kept quiet, convinced that she was protecting the church, when, in reality, I was helping to hide the darkness that lived inside her. The invitation arrived discreetly, as everything within the church usually was. A note delivered by one of the bishop's advisors, carefully folded, with my name written in small, firm letters. Special board meeting, Wednesday at 7 p.m. Your presence is required. It wasn't common for a woman to be called to a leadership meeting outside of regular hours, but I didn't question it. I assumed it was about the Sisters' Committee or perhaps a charitable activity. I put on my best dress, the same one I wore to conferences, tied my hair back, and prayed before leaving home. Lord, use me according to your will. When I arrived at the chapel, the hallway light was dim. The main hall was empty, and the ticking of the clock seemed to echo off the walls. In the office, I found 3 men seated: the bishop, his first counselor, and the stake president. The air was heavy, and I knew immediately that this would not be an ordinary conversation. The stake president greeted me with a rehearsed smile and asked me to sit down. The bishop looked down, leafing through some papers that looked like visitation reports. None of them began with a prayer, which was unusual. When the silence became awkward, the president began, "Sister Margaret, we have received information that you have been receiving many confidences from the sisters, reports, comments, and even accusations." I nodded, trying to appear calm. "Yes, Mr. President. They trust me. I just try to advise them, to pray with them." He crossed his hands on the table and replied in a paternalistic tone, "That's commendable. But we need to remember that not all pain needs to be documented." I was confused. Like this, it was the bishop who completed the sentence, raising his eyes for the first time. "Some matters, sister, are best resolved between the Lord and people's consciences. Recording everything can cause misunderstandings." I looked at them, trying to understand what they were asking me. "Are you referring to the sisters who came to me because of abuse and domestic problems?" "Exactly," the president replied, his voice firm. "When we report something without concrete evidence, we put the reputation of leaders and entire families at risk." That word, reputation, it sounded like blasphemy in my head. "But what about the victims?" I asked, my voice trembling. "They need help. Some are even afraid to go home." The bishop sighed, resting his hands on the table. "The faith of the people is more important than the pain of some, Sister Margaret. If we start publicizing these things, we risk weakening the testimony of many." The phrase cut me to the core. People's faith, more important than the pain of some. It was as if he were saying, the body may suffer, but the image of the church must remain intact. I adjusted myself in the chair, trying to maintain my composure. "So, are you saying that we should ignore these situations?" "No, not at all," the president replied. "We must pray for them. Prayer is more powerful than any accusation." The advisor, who had remained silent until then, added, "Remember, sister, Satan is cunning. He uses resentment to divide the flock. Sometimes, the enemy even speaks through those we believe are hurting." My heart raced. I recognized that tone. It was the tone the church used to transform suffering into sin. "So, should I stop listening?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You should listen, but not feed into it," the bishop replied calmly. "You are a servant of the Lord. Your role is to calm tempers, not to stir up distrust." For a moment, the air disappeared from the room. I felt the weight of 25 years of faith tightening in my chest. The same calling that once filled me with purpose now seemed like a prison, disguised as a mission. The president continued, as if issuing an order. "We need you to trust us and stop recording these accounts in the Relief Society minutes. It's important that the minutes reflect faith and unity, not confusion and weakness." I nodded, but my body was trembling. "Understood." He smiled, satisfied, and said, "We know it can be difficult, but the Lord rewards obedience." The meeting ended without a prayer. They stood up, shook my hand cordially, and returned to their routines, as if nothing serious had been said. I left the room as one leaves a funeral. Outside, the hallway was deserted. The temple lights reflected off the waxed floor, and the silence was so profound I could hear my own footsteps. I walked slowly to the Relief Society hall and sat in the front row. The chairs were lined up, the hymn books stacked, the fresh flowers on the table. Everything seemed in order. Everything seemed holy. But, for the first time, that place made me uneasy. I remembered the Women who had come to me, their low voices, their teary eyes, each one carried a story that I was now being instructed to forget. I thought of the young woman who feared her husband, the girl who wept after an interview with the counselor, the sister who disappeared from the ward without explanation, and I wondered, if the church is the body of Christ, why do we treat its wounds with silence? As I gazed at the empty pulpit, I felt something inside me finally breaking. I still loved the gospel. I still believed in God. But I was beginning to understand that perhaps God was no longer in that system I had served with such devotion. That night, I prayed before going to sleep. But my words were no longer words of submission. He simply said, "Lord, if faith needs the suffering of the innocent to sustain itself, then I no longer want that kind of faith." It was the first genuine prayer I had offered in many years, and even amidst the tears, I felt a strange peace, because, in that instant, I realized that my conscience was awakening and that perhaps the voice of God had never come from the pulpit, but from within the women whom the church taught me to silence. From that day forward, I never looked at the bishop the same way again. The respect was still there, but the trust that vanished like wet paper. And for the first time in 25 years, I doubted my calling, not from God, but from the institution that claimed to speak on his behalf. The nights began to stretch out like corridors without doors. I would lie down, turn off the lights, and the silence of the house would become a cathedral where guilt was the only hymn. The pillow held a damp secret that no one saw. I cried silently so as not to wake my husband, not to frighten the children when they came to visit on weekends, not to disturb the image I had built for myself, the serene leader, the sister who always has a word of faith. But, when the house slept, the truth awoke within me. I knelt so many times that I remember the cold texture of the carpet against my skin. I called out to God with the trembling voice of someone who knows they might be praying to the ceiling. "Lord, speak to me. Tell me what I should do." I obeyed. I trusted. I protected your church. The echo returned the same question to me, not the answer. "And who protected your daughters?" There were nights when I made lists, women's names, dates, fragments of stories. The sister who gets beaten and is ashamed of the bruises. The young woman who no longer wants to sit alone with the counselor. The widow who lost her voice after the spiritual readjustment interview. I would write, then tear it up, throw it away, then put it back in the trash and piece it back together, like someone trying to save a body. I would tell myself, if I keep quiet, I'll forget. But the memory would return with more details, clearer, more forceful. I prayed to forget, but God made me remember. I repeated the prayers I had been taught, the verses I had memorized, the exact vocabulary I had learned to use before the sacred. But the words, so polished, began to sound hollow, as if I had memorized the grammar of heaven and forgotten how to speak to God. Did the Lord want my silence, or my courage? The question settled in like a fever. At first, I drove it away with fasting. Then, with more service, I increased visits, brought soup, organized care schedules, filled my agenda. Charity, sometimes, is a shortcut to avoid facing the questions that hurt. One early morning, I woke with my heart racing. I dreamt of an empty Relief Society room. The chairs lined up like witnesses. On the pulpit, there was no hymn book. There was a box. I opened it, and out fell handwritten notes. "Help me. I'm afraid to go home." He said God would forgive me if I didn't tell. I woke up with the feeling that someone was whispering in my ear, "You were called to keep them, not to keep them." I sat up in bed, hugged my knees, and wept a cry that wasn't mine. It was a chorus of trapped voices. I began to understand how guilt behaves. It prays with you. It kneels, cries, repeats amen at the right time. Guilt has a veneer of devotion. It wears a skirt, carries scriptures under its arm, and says, "The Lord knows all things." But, deep down, it is fear's secretary. And I, without realizing it, had given it a position within myself. My house became quieter. I avoided social gatherings in the ward, fearing that any casual conversation would turn into a leadership topic. The sisters would hug me, thank me, and say I was an example of faith. It hurt like a compliment to a character. At home, looking in the mirror, I wondered, when did my faith become a costume? The reflection showed the image of a tired woman, with eyes hungry for peace. There was one night when I almost called the stake president at 1 in the morning. I had the phone in my hand, papers scattered on the table, and courage rising in my throat like a scream. But I remembered the phrase I had heard at the meeting: the faith of the people is more important than the pain of some. I put the phone away, and with it, I put away another piece of myself. On other nights, I tried to negotiate with God. I made promises. If you want me to speak, give me a clear sign. If you want me to be silent, take these memories away from me. The signs didn't come. The memories did, becoming ever clearer. It was as if heaven rejected my contract and, instead, signed another one. I will not give you peace as long as the peace you offer is made of silence. I began walking alone at dusk. The sound of footsteps on the sidewalk helped me organize my thoughts. The empty street became my prayer room. I would whisper each woman's name, like lighting invisible candles. Sometimes, I would stop in front of the closed chapel. The building, illuminated by cold lamps, looked more like an office than a sanctuary. I would touch the glass and ask God to dwell within me. If He didn't already dwelled there, the guilt then changed form. It stopped accusing me of being a sinner and began accusing me of being negligent. You swore to protect them. You taught them to smile while they bled. The memory of the young woman who disappeared after private conversations with a leader haunted me like a clock without hands. Always the same time, always the same room, always the same door closing. No matter how much I fasted, the door remained there, banging against my forehead from the inside. It was during this time that my Bible became marked on Jeremiah. They have healed the wound of my people superficially, saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. I read this verse as if finding my own certificate of guilt. I had said peace 1,000 times. I had offered prayers like gauze bandages on wounds that begged for surgery. And when the truth festered, I called it confusion. The sleepless nights began to produce small decisions. I stopped recording certain things as rumors and started noting them as warnings. I stopped promising that the leadership would take care of it, and began to say, you're not crazy. What you're feeling is real. It was a thread of disobedience woven with zeal. I still couldn't stand before the pulpit and say everything, but before God, I could no longer say anything. One early morning, I sat on the kitchen floor, my teacup still steaming, and wrote on a sheet of paper, what is faith? Below, I answered like a child learning to read again. Faith is not reputation. Faith is not silence. Faith is not obedience without conscience. Faith is not protecting the altar while the people bleed. When I finished, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, not relief, but direction. I went back to my room and prayed again. Without formulas, without perfect language, I simply said, God, I am afraid. I am afraid of making mistakes, of being unfair, of destroying something good, but I am even more afraid of continuing to call faith that which steals your voice from me. If you want my silence, silence my memory. If you want my courage, keep my memories alive. I fell asleep shortly after and dreamed of light, not stained glass light, nor auditorium light. It was the simple morning light coming through the window. In the dream, I opened the window, and air came in, and someone I don't know, who said, breathe. I woke up crying, but without that weight from before. I went to the living room, opened the curtains, and, for the first time in a long time, felt that God wasn't asking me to be perfect. He was asking me to be true. That week, a sister approached me with the same story I had heard countless times. I listened to her entire story without interrupting. When she finished, instead of saying, let's trust in the Lord, I said, let's seek help. You won't go alone. I'll go with you. She looked at me as if witnessing a miracle. Not because I had solved the problem I hadn't, but because, for the first time, someone speaking on behalf of faith didn't ask for silence. That night, I returned home, feeling lighter. Still afraid, still with doubts, but with a certainty coursing through my ribs like air. I prayed to forget, but God made me remember, and I understood. The miracle wasn't forgetting, it was remembering enough not to betray one's conscience. The sleepless nights haven't ended, but they've changed meaning. Now, when I lie down and the room darkens, I no longer ask God to cover my ears. I ask Him to give me bigger ears, ears for the whispers of those who cannot scream, courage to call things by their name, and faith, not the faith that closes your eyes, but the faith that keeps them open, even when they burn. Because if there is one prayer that God always seems to answer, it is this: teach me not to confuse your voice with the voice of fear. And since then, every sleepless night has become a discipline, every tear, a sacrament, every memory, a calling, not to protect the church, but ultimately, to protect the daughters of God. She appeared one ordinary Sunday afternoon, after sacrament meeting. She was a young woman of only 17, with dark hair falling over her face and trembling hands holding the young women's handbook. I knew her by sight. Her name was Emily. She used to sing in the choir. She was shy, sweet, one of those girls who always says thank you for everything. When she approached me, I thought she was going to ask for seminary guidance or some ward activity. But the look in her eyes made me freeze before she even said a word. "May I speak with you, alone?" he asked, almost whispering. I led her to the small Relief Society room at the end of the hall. The other sisters had already left, and the sound of the piano still echoed in the distance, as if the entire building breathed a heavy silence. I closed the door. She stood there, staring at the floor. "I don't know if I should tell you," he said, "but something happened during the interview with Brother Thomas." Brother Thomas was one of the bishop's advisors, a respected man, married, father of 3, always kind. He conducted the so-called worthiness interviews, private meetings where young people answered questions about moral purity, repentance, and faith. It was part of the custom. We all accepted it without question, but her voice trembled in a different way. He asked strange questions, very personal ones. He said he needed details to help me repent. She swallowed hard. Then he asked us to pray together. When I closed my eyes, I felt him touch my shoulder, and his hand stayed there for too long. My heart raced. I wanted to say something, but I was speechless. The girl was crying, and each tear seemed like a confession that heaven should have prevented. He told me not to tell anyone, she continued, that God had inspired him to guide me in a special way. I felt a bitter taste of fear. I wanted to run to the bishop, to scream, but something inside me whispered, "Be prudent, Margaret. Don't accuse a leader without proof." The phrase I had been taught so many times now bound me like a chain. I promised Emily I would take the matter to leadership. She nodded, wiping her face, and thanked me as if I had promised salvation. When she left, I sat in the chair and cried. I didn't know if it was for her, for myself, or for everything that was falling apart within my faith. The next morning, I went to the bishop's office. The smell of paper and cold coffee filled the air. I handed him a handwritten report. He read it slowly, expressionless. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Sister Margaret, you know how young people can exaggerate. Sometimes misunderstandings happen." She was scared. "Bishop, this is not made up." He crossed his hands on the table. "Let's pray for her. Brother Thomas is a faithful man. He has helped dozens of young people without any problem. The best thing to do is leave it in the Lord's hands." Wanted to insist, but he looked up, and there was something there that wasn't spiritual. It was authority. A kind of look that said, "We've talked enough already. You understand," he said, in a tone that mixed sweetness and threat, "that spreading this kind of thing can destroy families and shake the faith of young people. The church trusts in your discretion." I nodded, but my heart screamed otherwise. I left the room with the feeling of carrying a secret that weighed more than any written document. For weeks, I looked for Emily at the meetings. She never showed up again. I discreetly asked her mother, and she simply said, "Emily needs some time. She's going through things that come with age." But the way he looked away sent a chill down my spine. On the following Sundays, Brother Thomas continued to conduct the interviews, to distribute smiles, and to preach about purity. Every time I saw him ascend the pulpit, my stomach churned. I tried to pray, tried to believe that God was watching everything, but the divine silence mingled with the silence of the institution. One night, I dreamt about Emily. She was sitting in room 12, the same room where we used to have our young women's classes, and she was looking at me silently. In the dream, I said, "I did what I could," and she replied, "No, you did what you were told." I woke up sweating, with my Bible on the floor. I tried to find her again. I called, I wrote letters, but no one answered. One of the sisters in the ward said, cautiously, that the family had moved to another city. The bishop thought it best that way, so she could start over away from the gossip that never came to pass because no one knew. No one, except me. That disappearance tore me apart. I started losing my appetite, sleeping little, and becoming irritated by the prayers that once comforted me. Each hymn seemed ironic, each meeting a mechanical repetition. The bishop would greet me in the hallways, and I would respond with an empty smile. He would say, "Stay strong, sister. Sometimes faith is strongest when we don't have answers." But I no longer wanted answers. I wanted justice. In one of the Relief Society meetings, we discussed the topic Women of Faith. I read the suggested passage, but the words caught in my throat. Suddenly, I realized I was crying in front of the sisters. I tried to compose myself, but the weight of hypocrisy choked me. One of them asked, "Is everything all right, Sister Margaret?" I simply replied, "No, sister, nothing is right." After that day, I was never the same again. I spent months trying to convince myself that the bishop was right, that Emily was in good hands, that the Lord would take care of her. But deep down, I knew it was a godly lie, spiritual anesthesia, the kind of lie the church uses to keep up appearances. Years passed, and her name was forgotten. I never heard from Emily, the girl from room 12, again, but she stayed with me, like a shadow in the corner of my memory. Sometimes, when the wind blows against the chapel windows, I still hear her voice asking, "Is this normal, Sister Margaret?" And I, with a weary soul, answer within myself, "No, my daughter, it never was." There are wounds that time cannot heal because they were born not from error, but from omission. And that is the worst kind of guilt, that of those who believed they were serving God when, in reality, they helped keep the altar clean, while blood flowed beneath it. In my mind, the image of Emily never ages. She remains 17, sitting in room 12, silently gazing at me. And every night, before I sleep, I wonder if the Lord still hears my prayers, or if He, like her, simply turned away when He saw that I chose silence. I tried to forget her. I tried to convince my conscience that I did what I could. But my heart always returns to that Sunday, that look, that voice, the promise I made and didn't keep. And then, every night, when I kneel, the same thought crosses my mind. I didn't lose faith that day. I lost myself. And her name returns, soft and cruel, like an ancient hymn, Emily, the girl from room 12. Years had passed since Emily's disappearance, but her silence never left me. Each new meeting, each prayer, each Sunday, seemed to carry the ghost of everything I hadn't done. I still served as a Relief Society leader, but I was no longer the same woman. My speeches sounded empty. My words echoed in a temple that didn't listen. I obeyed, yes, but I obeyed out of fear. Fear of displeasing, fear of being called a rebel, fear of admitting that something was deeply wrong, until the day I saw it all happen again. She was a new girl in the ward, from another city. She was 20 years old, with a shy smile and the distrustful look of someone who had seen too much. One afternoon, he approached me after an activity. He said he needed to talk, that he didn't know who to trust anymore. We went to the same room, the cursed room 12, and she closed the door. "Sister Margaret," she began, her voice trembling, "the counselor called me in to talk about purity. He asked things that made me feel unclean." I tried to change the subject, but he insisted. He said he needed to know details of my repentance. My whole body froze. It was the same story, told with different words, the same method, the same manipulation, the same use of faith as an instrument of power. And I, once again, was there, listening. Only this time, something inside me refused to die. "And what did you do?" I asked. She replied, "I got up and left. But he told me to come back and said that if I told anyone, I would be sinning against the priesthood." My heart raced. The room felt like it was spinning. The air grew heavy, as if the walls were pushing me out. Emily's voice came back to my mind, echoing from the past. "He told me not to tell anyone." I closed my eyes for a moment and understood that this was the point of no return. If I remained silent one more time, I would die inside. Not physically but spiritually. I knew that obeying would be more comfortable, but, for the first time, I realized that comfort is a disguise for fear. The next day, I went to see the bishop, the same man who had told me years before to leave it in the Lord's hands. I entered, without asking permission, and placed an envelope on the table. Inside was a handwritten letter, with all the accounts from the sisters who had already sought me out. More than 20 names. "Bishop, it's all there. And this time, I won't stay silent." He turned pale. "Sister Margaret, this is very serious. I know, what happens to the young women of this church is serious, while you call what is actually cowardice, prudence." He tried to interrupt me, but I continued. "You can remove me from my position, discipline me, call me a rebel, but you won't force me to lie in God's name." The room fell silent. He looked at me as if witnessing a heresy being born, but I no longer felt fear. The following week, I was called to a meeting with the stake president. He listened attentively, but in the end, said the same thing as always. Sister, I understand your pain, but we need to avoid scandals. Think about the faith of others. I replied firmly, there is no true faith built on lies. I left that room knowing my fate was sealed. Within a few weeks, I was released from the calling. They announced from the pulpit that I was going to serve in other areas of the community. The speech was polished, but the silence among the members was cutting. I saw in their eyes the same judgment I had so often used against other sisters. She must have sinned. She must have lost the spirit. But deep down, I knew for the first time, I was free. In the following days, anonymous messages began to arrive. Sisters who sought me out in secret, saying, "It happened to me too." They were old stories, hidden, erased from the records. Women who had been advised to pray more when they reported inappropriate behavior. Young women who left the church because no one believed them. Mothers who carried the guilt of not protecting their daughters. We sat in discreet cafes, exchanging glances of recognition and pain. I discovered there was much more to us than I had imagined. Each story was a mirror, and in each mirror, the image of a faith distorted by power. I began to understand that the true gospel never asked for blind submission. It asked for conscience. The Christ I read about in the scriptures didn't use fear to rule. He used compassion to liberate. The Christ I knew wouldn't tell me to be quiet, he would tell me to stand up. Over time, I realized that obedience had become an idol within the church, a lesser God that demanded constant sacrifice of our voices, our wills, our humanity. And the more we obeyed, the further we strayed from the truth. I myself spent years kneeling before this idol, calling what was merely fear with a halo, faith. Obedience without truth is just fear, wearing a halo. This phrase has become my mantra. I returned to reading the scriptures with new eyes, and on every page I found a forgotten woman, Mary Magdalene, who dared to speak, Esther, who defied the king, Deborah, who judged among men. None of them were remembered for remaining silent. All were remembered because they dared to say enough. And then I realized, the true gospel didn't need my obedience, it needed my courage. News of my actions spread. I was called dangerous, influenced by outside voices, an infiltrated feminist. They said I was leading the sisters astray, and perhaps they were I was leading them astray. Yes, leading them astray from fear, from shame, from the silence that kills the soul. I received letters from other stakes, messages from women I've never met, thanking me for speaking. One of them wrote, "You don't know me, but your story has made me believe again that God is not the same God as theirs." I cried when I read that, because, deep down, I too was rediscovering God, the God who doesn't live in offices, the God who doesn't hide behind meetings, the God who hears the muffled cries of his daughters and answers through their consciences. One day, one of the young women I had counseled told me something that I still remember today. "Sister Margaret, you always said that the Lord wants us to be pure. Now, I understand he wants us to be pure from fear." She smiled, with tears in her eyes. At that moment, I realized that awakening is not rebellion, it's a return to what is divine, but also human, a return to the truth that religion tried to erase. The church lost me, but I found the gospel. And amidst all the wounds, I understood something that took a lifetime to learn. God never wanted my blind obedience. He wanted my conscience to be awakened. After I spoke for the first time, what seemed like the end turned into a beginning. I imagined that, upon breaking the silence, I would be left alone, abandoned by friends, by my sisters in the church, by those who once called me an example of faith. And, in fact, I was forgotten by many. The smiles disappeared, the invitations ceased, the phone calls never came again. But, in the midst of this desert, voices began to emerge, voices I didn't expect, voices that, like mine, had been silenced for years and now echoed, fragile at first, but firm as revelation. The first was from a sister named Ruth. She met me by chance at the market, approached hesitantly, and said softly, "I heard what you did, Margaret, and ... thank you." Her eyes filled with tears before I could answer. It happened to me too. Many years ago, I told my story, and they told me not to tarnish the Lord's name, so I kept quiet. She took a deep breath. "You have no idea how relieved I was when I heard your story." That conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it affected me more than 25 years of meetings. I left there trembling. For the first time, I realized I wasn't a woman, isolated in her pain. I was part of something bigger, an invisible current of wounded women, silently supporting each other's weight. In the following days, I began receiving messages from former members. Some came from other cities, others from different countries. Mothers, daughters, wives, young women, elderly ladies. They all said the same thing. I thought I was the only one. We formed a small group, nameless, unstructured. We met in cafes, sometimes in discreet homes, other times in parks, our hearts racing, like those participating in a secret ceremony. Each meeting began the same way, with silence, the silence of those who no longer needed to explain, because they understood each other's pain. Then came the stories. One woman recounted being expelled from the church for denouncing a leader's harassment. Another confessed that she still attended meetings out of fear of losing her family. A young woman wept as she said her mother never believed her. And, amidst so many tears, something new was born, not rebellion, but communion. It was as if God Himself were sitting with us, not in polished pulpits, but on simple chairs where truth finally had room to breathe. I realized that true faith isn't lost when you speak, it's reborn. Because faith isn't made of dogma, but of humanity. And only when we drop our masks can God truly dwell among us. We started exchanging messages every day. Each of us looked after the other, offering shelter, listening, courage. We made a silent pact. We would never again let another woman go through what we went through alone. With each new story, the network grew. It was as if invisible threads, woven by pain, transformed into something sacred, a mantle of protection that the church itself should have been, but never was. One night, we organized an open meeting, the first outside the walls of religion. We rented a small community room, arranged chairs in a circle, and lit candles. The atmosphere was simple, but there was a power there that I had never felt, not even inside a temple. One by one, the women began to stand up and tell their stories. The room filled with tears, but also with light. When it was my turn, I took a deep breath and said, "For years, I thought God was in the silence of obedience. Today I know that He has always been in the courage of truth." There was a moment of silence, not the silence of oppression, but the sacred silence of one who understands the weight of a revelation. And then one of the women, her voice weak but firm, replied, "We were never alone." These words echoed through the room like a psalm. We were never alone. None of us had walked alone through that valley of shadows. Even when we thought God had fallen silent, He was there disguised in every woman who resisted, in every mother who prayed, in every daughter who dared to speak. From that day on, I began to write accounts, memoirs, letters without an addressee. I wrote not for the world, but for the women who were still trapped inside churches, believing that silence was a virtue. I published some texts anonymously, and the response was overwhelming. Hundreds of messages began to arrive. Some said, "You gave me courage." Others simply, "Thank you for reminding me that I'm not crazy." I realized that telling the truth can be the most spiritual act there is, because the truth heals what religion pretends not to see. And when a woman stands up and speaks, she is not only freeing herself, she is paving the way for all others. The network grew so much that, in a short time, we began to help each other with concrete actions: shelters for women fleeing abusive homes, campaigns to expose practices of spiritual manipulation, psychological support groups. Faith, that true and living faith, flourished where before there was only fear. A young former missionary once wrote to me, "Sister Margaret, I lost everything when I left the church, but when I heard your story, I realized that what I lost was only the noise. The voice of God was in the silence, but in the right silence, the one that comes after courage, not the one that comes before it." I cried when I read this, and I understood that the true gospel is not confined to books or positions of power. It lives in the capacity to love and protect, even when that means challenging the system that speaks in God's name. Today, when people ask me if I still have faith, I smile, because faith never went away, it just transformed. It's no longer the faith that kneels before men, but the faith that stands alongside women. We continue to meet from time to time. Some of us are still afraid, others already speak in public, but in each meeting there is a common certainty that faith is not lost when you speak, it is reborn in the voice that decides to tell the truth. And when someone asks me what prayer is, I answer without hesitation. Sometimes, telling the truth is the most sacred prayer there is. Sometimes, Telling the truth is the most sacred prayer, because it was the truth and only the truth that gave us back God, not the God of the pulpit, but the God who dwells where there is courage, compassion, and light. And now, when I look back, I realize that silence was never sacred. The sacred has always been in the sound of the voices that finally dared to speak. For 25 years, I was taught that silence was an act of faith. Today, I know that silence was fear. Fear of disappointing, fear of being judged, fear of losing the love of a God who, deep down, never asked me to be silent. For all those years, I lived believing that obedience was synonymous with devotion. Now I understand that it was merely submission disguised as faith. They said that speaking was rebellion, that questioning was spiritual weakness. But today I realize that true weakness lies in accepting injustice and calling it divine will. I was called a traitor, an apostate, an enemy of the church. They said I lost the spirit, that I let myself be influenced by the world, that I became dangerous. But if telling the truth is being dangerous, then I accept that label, because I prefer to be dangerous through honesty than wholly through silence. I prefer to face the judgment of men than to continue serving a lie in the name of God. Today, I understand that God never asked for blind obedience. He asked for brave hearts, hearts willing to walk through the shadows in search of the light, hearts that prefer to bleed for the truth rather than live comfortably within hypocrisy. For a long time, I believed that faith meant keeping silent and enduring. Now, I know that faith is raising your voice, even trembling, and saying, "This is not right." The faith I was taught was made of fear. It was a faith built on control, shame, and the silencing of women. But the faith I found outside those walls is alive, free, and human. It is a faith that does not fear the truth because it understands that truth is the very breath of God. True faith is not born of obedience, but of conscience. It flourishes when we stop confusing the sacred with power and begin to see the divine in the act of being whole. For a long time, I believed that God's voice came from pulpits, sermons, and authorities. Now I know it comes from the hearts of those who dare to speak the truth. God doesn't speak through those who remain silent out of convenience, but through those who rise up out of compassion. God's love never asked me for silence. It asked me for courage, because silence can keep a church standing, but it is courage that sustains the soul. Today I speak. I speak for those who are still afraid. I speak for the women who are silenced within the chapels. I speak for the young people who believed in empty promises. I speak for those who are ostracized for refusing to lie. I speak for all those who have learned, as I have, that obedience is not the same as belief. I speak because I have discovered that true faith has no owner and that God has never been the property of an institution. Some say I've lost my faith, but that's not true. I've only lost my fear. And when fear goes away, faith finds room to breathe. Today, my faith is simple. I believe in a God who loves truth more than silence, who prefers a sincere heart to an obedient mouth. I believe in a God who is not offended by questions, but is saddened by lies. True faith is not a prison. It is a path, and on this path, sometimes it is necessary to disobey men in order to obey one's own conscience. I learned that serving God is not about protecting the sins of leaders, but about protecting the souls they hurt. I learned that silence may seem like piety, but in reality it is complicity. I learned that when the church asks for silence, God asks for a voice. Therefore, if you are listening to me now and feel the same weight that I felt, know that you are not alone. There is no shame in questioning. There is no sin in seeking the truth. The real sin is accepting lies and calling them faith. God does not dwell in fear. He dwells in courage. And it is in courage that faith is reborn. For years, I thought obedience was the path to heaven. Now I know that heaven draws near when the soul is set free. Because God never wanted anyone to follow him with their eyes closed. He wanted us to seek him with our eyes open, seeing, discerning, loving consciously. I lost friends, jobs, and the life I knew. But I found something infinitely greater. I found myself. I discovered that silence kept me inside the church, but far from God, and that the truth, however harsh, always leads me back to him. Today, I say, with all the serenity of my soul, God does not want our silence. He wants our truth, and if this truth bothers those who live by power, so be it. Because faith that needs lies to survive was never faith, it was merely control. The truth may hurt, but silence kills. Silence destroys the soul, extinguishes the spirit. corrodes hope. The truth, on the contrary, liberates, and when the truth enters, it doesn't destroy faith, it destroys the deception that imprisoned it. That's why I speak, not out of anger, but out of love. I speak because I love the God who gave me a voice, and not the system that tried to take it away. I speak because I believe that the true gospel is not afraid of the light. I speak because, if silence was the price of my faith, the truth is now my offering to God. Today, I conclude my testimony with the certainty that there is no faith without freedom, nor true God. Where there is fear, God never asked for blind obedience. He asked for brave hearts. Comment: I'm awake. I want to know the truth. Like if this story touched you. Subscribe for more real stories. Watch the next video, another testimony of someone who dared to tell the truth. And as my words dissolve into thin air, I leave you with only one thought. Truth is not the end of faith, it is the beginning of it. Because God is not offended by those who speak. He is saddened by those who, out of fear, choose silence.